for posterity's sake. All right, let's just open up a word of prayer real quick before we gather for our before we start our Safe Sanctuary training. Heavenly Father, I pray today, Lord, that you just pour out your Spirit upon us during this teaching moment, that we keep you in the forefront. All of our ministries, working with children or vulnerable persons, all of this is because you've called us to love on and share you with their lives. But Lord, we ask that your Spirit guide us in this conversation today and moving forward as we can create a safe space for children and follow the rules that have been set down to keep that place safe. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, and I'm just going to do this kind of briefly. And I will ask a couple questions throughout, as well as if you have a question, don't hesitate to interrupt. But have all of you guys read or had taken a few minutes to ever read our Safe Sanctuary policy? It looks fairly thick. It's not. It's just a few pages, really, like 7 pages. The rest are forms. It's not a bad idea for us to have a copy in here that you just peruse sometime. I will go through it a little bit today, fairly briefly, fairly quickly, touching on some key points. And then I want us to kind of walk around the building for a few moments to look at some things. Background checks for people that work with children and vulnerable persons. That could be persons with disabilities, that could be seniors, and a variety of those individuals. But primarily this focuses generally on children and youth in the church, keeping them safe. So like I said, we're supposed to review this with you periodically, and then also possibly renew the background checks. That is important. Gerald was a part of one of the last ones we did. We do a district and conference one as well that clergy have to go to periodically too, and just to always keep that at the forefront. I will say this, I often kind of get bristly over being required to go to these trainings is it every 2 years or 4 years, Gerald?
I don't know. I think they've changed it.
It seems like it's every year, but I think it's every 2 years. We go to these, they're called boundaries training for clergy. I always get kind of bristly and I say to the district superintendent, do we really have to do this? And the comment is, as long as clergy keep doing stupid things, we have to do this. It's important to protect the most vulnerable persons in our churches. That's why we have these policies. I won't go through everything. I just want to touch on a couple key points, why it's changed over the years. When I first began this, for example, there was nothing in our policies around social media, texting, that kind of stuff. They are now in our policies, and so we will briefly touch on that. In our Safe Sanctuary policy, we do have a section where it defines different terms. I won't go through all of those, such as participant, church, representatives, etc. I do want to touch on a couple things, and that is abuse and the different forms of that, just very briefly, because our policy does break these down, and it is important that we are talking about verbal abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse in all the different varieties that may come under. And so we just want to be aware of that. It's not just one. It is verbal, it is physical, as well as sexual for that. The scope of our policy is to remind all those persons working with in direct or indirect contact with children that they are aware of this policy, that we all follow it. And that is a big part of this. We actually review our insurance policies every year. We have to review this every year and make sure it is enforced. Because if you have it in writing, and they do want every church to have their own Safe Sanctuary policy, because every church is a little bit different. And they do review this, and they want us to make sure, because if something were to happen for insurance purposes, if you say, yes, we are background checking people, and we don't do it, we're liable. If we say, yes, we make sure we're following the rule of 3, and then we don't do it, we're liable. Okay, so it is important. If it's in here, we do want to follow this. So basically we're talking about supervision. I mentioned the rule of 3. I just want to start right there, that a youth assistant, and I want to make this point out because we do have some teenagers, for example, but a youth assistant may work with participants only when supervised by an adult. Okay, so we never have teenagers in charge of the kids by themselves. That is a key part of this. I mentioned the rule of 3, just to remind us of that. To achieve compliance with the safe sanctuary policy, it may be necessary to combine groups, recruit, or train additional volunteers, or even cancel an event. That's how serious they take this. Recognizing that there is safety in numbers, participants will be instructed to use the buddy system. It is also strongly encouraged that there be at least one adult present during each event that is trained in first aid and CPR. And the church will attempt to make training available periodically. Observation of activities in rooms is essential, whether it's done through windows, open doors, glass doors, electronic technology, etc. So I just want to use this example. Gerald, since you're staying there, can you shut the door real quick, please? So for example, we have the youth room right next door, the children's room right next door. It's got that Dutch door on top of that, so we can close the door, but the top door, if the kids are in there, the top door's always open, right? The pastor's office has a window in it. That's required for our offices, that we always have a window open, no closed private doors. But notice, we do have a solid door between there and coming into here. So I would argue, I've never thought about this, but I would argue with the trustees, it's probably not a bad idea to put a window in that door, because we do want to have that transparency always when we have young persons in the church or any vulnerable persons. I did serve a church that went through, it had these big solid core doors. They went through and they fitted all the doors with windows just like that. But they thought the pastor might need privacy, so they put a screen that the pastor could pull down on the back side of that. Nullified all the effect of doing that. So you want to be aware of, do it right, and so forth. So we're going to take some time to look at some of these kinds of things.
Just keeping that door open count, like usually, because like those, like it goes through there, so usually we keep those.
It could. I personally be more comfortable having a window in that door, because, like for
And
example,
normally I keep
and
that door
and
open.
Stacy does
But last week we had a young one, and so we ended up closing it, and
Yeah.
it's like, I
Yeah.
don't like closing
Yeah.
it because
Yes.
then.
But yeah, when I've been in here, usually I've left that door open too.
I do too.
So that's a good point. You're aware of it, so that's the important part of that, and then following through with that. Something to keep in mind, persons wanting to work with participants should be members or regular attendees of this church for at least 6 months or upon approval of the Safe Sanctuary Committee. That's a key part. Somebody should be part of our community prior to just beginning to work with our children. There should always be a minimum of 2 adults in the child care room, or when less than 2 adults are present, the top half of that door, I would argue, should always remain open anyways if there are 2 adults present. I do mention the 2 adult rule, the rule of 3. You always want to have that never one person alone with 1 child. There should always at least be 3 people present, and they really shouldn't be from the same family. Now, again, that's not always easy in smaller churches, or I'll even say rural churches. You shouldn't have family members on the church council, right? But again, the reality is, in smaller churches, that just doesn't play out. So it doesn't always work that way. But it's something to strive towards. And for example, we're going to be taking a field trip pretty soon down to the Ark and Creation Museum. So our policy here, for example, does stipulate this. For routine or common field trips taken by children, youth, or vulnerable adults, there must be a trip permission form on file or completed prior to the trip that is signed by the parent, guardian, or caregiver. For field trips, there must be a field trip permission form completed for each child, youth, or vulnerable adult and signed by the parent, guardian, or caregiver. Briefly, we did a church I was involved with years ago, did this big VBS where we trucked kids in and so forth. We drive around, there were neighborhoods that were lower income. One of these was a housing community. We drove in there, we were picking up kids that are already registered, right? Already registered, parental permission slips signed. Suddenly, cousins start showing up from other houses. Oh, this is my cousin Jim, can he come? Well, who's his guardian, right? Pretty soon, we have all these kids, and we have no parents authorizing us to take these kids. Do you think we took the children with us? No, we did. We did. Dumbest thing ever. We did. But it happens. You get in these situations, right? You're doing a community outreach event here, and you've just got people showing up. Always have to be aware of what's going on
Hey, Tom.
in your environment.
For this event, my plan is that we will have forms signed, but in this case, there will be a parent there with each of those children. Would
Okay.
it be required or necessary?
No,
Okay.
they're with
I
their
was
parents.
gonna ask the same question, if the
They're with
parents
their
there,
parents.
if they need
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, so one thing to be aware of though, like on some of these kinds of things would be like, you know how the schools do their healthcare form stuff? I mean, you know, some things, it's just to be aware of things can happen, and so you always want to be prepared for an emergency, something like that. Speaking of overnight accommodations, just very briefly, since I've been here, we've not done this, but we have one coming up. It says here that we strongly recommend that at least 2 adults are present in sleeping rooms. When children, youth, and vulnerable adults share a room with an adult, the adult supervisor shall sleep in a separate bed from children, youth, and vulnerable adult. We strongly recommend that vulnerable adults sleep in a separate room from the children and youth participants. Recognizing that accommodations may be restrictive in some cases, one adult supervisor in a room is adequate. If the supervisor is never alone with the participant unless they are a parent, guardian, or caregiver, a completed field trip permission form must be completed. I did a mission trip one time where, we have boys in one room, girls in another. There's like, say, 10 boys in one room. It's a large room. And, it's time to go to sleep. We're getting up early. And those guys just want to horse around, right? 2 in the morning, they're still like throwing softballs at each other, screwing around. I'm in that room. I get up. I'm like going to sleep in a common room. I'm like, be unsupervised. I don't care. I mean, but I was wrong. This has been years ago, right? You don't want to make sure you follow these rules. So I do want to point out we do have a variety of forms here. Part of this is a screening for adults who are teaching or caregiving positions. There is a servant leader application form that we would want you to have you complete. And the Safe Sanctuary Committee is responsible for obtaining a servant leadership application and conducting screenings for all persons. If any reports raise questions about fitness of the applicant, this church's Safe Sanctuary Committee will disapprove the applicant. I want you to hear that. Will disapprove the applicant. There's no well buts. Results, though, are to be kept confidential. Years ago, I had a church where we had a key church leader heavily involved. She took me aside and said, just so you know, I can't work with the children. She goes, I am a convicted felon. And this was totally like caught everybody off guard. It was on the committee when we had shared this. None of us had a clue. It was not that she'd done anything inappropriately, but a family member of her who lived in her house was dealing drugs, and she owned the home. And she actually, while she never served time, she did have a felon on her record because of the drug possession and dealing. So I just want to briefly touch on training. The church, as it says, shall develop and implement training, orientation procedures for all persons. The key thing is that if you've never been through it, just to sit down and walk through that with the pastor or the Safe Sanctuaries training, with an emphasis placed on discipline, physical, emotional boundaries, and leader misconduct. I do want to, since I just mentioned leader misconduct, there is a procedure for reporting of incidences when they happen. When an adult leader of an event or activity suspects that there is abuse of a participant has taken place, leaders shall follow the attachment regarding steps in reporting the abuse. And we have this little flow chart. It's really small, you'd have to all look at it. But one thing I do have a question about, I printed this off, this is what we turned in. The phone numbers on here, I'm going to ask this question. The phone numbers, I'm going to assume these are, one's obviously senior pastors and the church council leaders. I'm not sure what the other two are, but normal procedure for this would be, you would contact the pastor. If it is the pastor of the church, you contact the staff parish chair, church council chair, and you push it up to the district, okay? If it's something other than the pastor, you contact the pastor, and then the pastor and the church council chair and staff parish would deal with that if it was appropriate as a staff person, for example. Here's a big part of this. We do not comment about it, though. The district and conference have a media team to deal with things that happen when they're, so if something's reported in the media or in the news, we never comment. If somebody calls me, I refer them to the conference media people. We never comment on instances. I have been a part of a church where I followed a situation, was not the pastor, it was a staff member, and the media was heavily involved in the Dayton area, So luckily, the church I was a part of was not involved in any of the media conversations, but the other 5 churches were. I'm not sure how that church stayed out of it, but the other 5 churches were, and you'd have people commenting. I'm like, no, thank God United Methodists do get something right. It's all handled higher up than us when there are issues. The biggest thing is, though, to follow that. Contact the pastor if it's a staff person, and then we push that through. We don't. I do want to report this. We are mandatory reporters. Okay, mandatory reporters. There is no like, well, I thought about it. If you suspect something, you're required to tell me. If you're working with children in the church. Do you have any questions about any of that? To me, it's always fairly obvious, but until you actually, when the tires hit, the rubber hits the road, then questions always seem to come up. Appropriate discipline. Children and youth should be made aware that appropriate behavior is expected at all events. Gentle reminders are always necessary when dealing with children and youth. When these reminders don't work, then discipline needs to move on to the next step. In those cases where behavior has to be addressed in designated event, adults should handle that. I will say this. I would contact the parent and have the parent deal with that. I'm never comfortable with church folk disciplining someone else's child. Things happen, I get it. But like in here it says, if it's appropriate to use a timeout, that's okay. But I still would say contact the parent, let the parent deal with their child. Always keep communication with that parent as much as possible. Appropriate physical and emotional boundaries. Physical boundaries are most important in dealing with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Persons working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults have to understand and respect boundaries. Obviously, these boundaries change as children grow. A young child sitting in the lap of a caregiver is most appropriate, whereas an older child or youth sitting in an adult's lap would not be acceptable. Hugs and kisses from a toddler to an adult are entirely different than the same from a youth. I will argue this. I don't ever think it's really appropriate for adults to be hugging the children, or especially teens. It's good practice not to do. Obviously things can come up, but you'll notice, like, I'll use Carly as an example. Let's say Carly's out here doing produce and she wants to say goodbye or after church and she wants to come over. I'm always like, I always call it the Methodist side hug. I always kind of do like, I never do like a hug. It's best to just not. I don't know about this church. I've not seen it here per se, but a lot of churches, as people get older, some of the older generations, hugging was always an important part of their upbringing. And you'll see church members want to hug, like as you're doing a handshake aisle, they might give a hug. 20 years ago, I was trained by a female pastor that said, no, just do not hug your parishioners. But I also put that down to taking with our kids. Obviously things, you need to be careful of that, be aware of that, the physical touching. But also emotional boundaries are just as important. As a child grows older, it's important for an adult to maintain appropriate boundaries in relationships. It is important for those working with children and youth to not step outside of those lines and allow the younger person to become too attached to them. It is important for the older person to be careful where conversations might lead and to steer clear of inappropriate talk. When an adult recognizes that there might be an issue with those boundaries, significant space should be allowed to come between them and the child or youth in question. If this does not solve the problem, then the event leadership should address the issue. I want to just briefly jump a little bit to social media and electronic communications. It is never appropriate to be texting or commenting with children or youth on social media directly or in texting. I did have now if it's your own child, that's one thing, or like, your aunt, that's one thing. But I had a youth group member, boy, who, he was going through something difficult with his parents. He was a teenager. He texted me at like 2 in the morning one time. And my response was, First, you need to go back to bed. Secondly, don't be texting me at 2 in the morning. And I said, I need to tell your mom now. And now I knew some of the situation going on, and I made sure that this person knew that he was texting me sometimes about some stuff. And they actually gave me permission to text him if something was going on, because some things going on in their family ultimately. But I always make sure there's open line of communications with the parents. I never text. I don't like to comment on things online and so forth with young people. I just think it's better to say no, just don't do it. It's harder when you're working with youth and you're the youth pastor or something like that, but it's always a safe policy to have. You just shouldn't do it. I mean, it's just not a good thing. Spiritual boundaries, not something that I've seen in others. I like it. That's in ours. We are required to create a safe space for all persons to encounter God, and in doing so, we want to make sure we create a spiritually safe location for that.
My child.
We're not laughing now.
Do you need to go save him from the two dads over there?
I say I hear Noah just to scream louder and louder.
So, sorry, it's a squirrel thing for me. If I see you guys laughing, I'm like, what's wrong? If you do need to go check one, that's fine, seriously. Please do. But no, part of that is it's oftentimes we do mean well, and we don't even realize that we can harm someone spiritually or emotionally, and we don't even intend to do that. We mean well. Actually, I'll talk about this a little bit in my sermon today, but oftentimes, when people go through difficult situations, they're looking for comfort, and it puts us in a difficult place sometimes. We don't know what to say, so one of the things we'll say things like, well, there's a purpose for everything. No, don't say things, just be quiet. Let persons talk. Let them say things. You don't know how they might receive that information. And so that's a key part of that, is we create a safe space, spiritual-wise, mental health-wise, and physical-wise. Any comments or questions? Now, I flew through this because of timing on that, but I also want us to just walk around for a few minutes and just look at spaces, right? So we asked, for example, about that bathroom being open and so forth, the door being open if like things are going on in here. I'll give you an example. Years ago when they first came up with Safe Sanctuary, they said, take all the sofas out of your churches. Right, like that was the recommendation, because nothing good ever happens on a sofa. Really? Really? And then you find out, oh yeah, okay, things do happen. Okay, it's a good point. But you have to be aware of what's your environment like. So I actually do want us to walk around the building just really quickly for like 5 minutes and look at our space and go, okay, does this pass what we'd call a safe space for children and vulnerable persons in our churches? Okay, John.
And I did have a question. What if you suspect like abuse from like the parents at home, like if you're...
Yeah, great question.
I don't know if that's similar with like schools, if they have
great question. So contact the pastor.
Sure. Right
away if you suspect something. And I will tell you, myself or any other pastor, better not call the home. When I was a teacher, that happened. I had a student that something was happening at home. She was a good student. Her grades suddenly dropped. One day she came to school and there was some signs. I actually contacted our school counselors and administration and said, I'm a little bit worried about this. And the school called and talked to the father, who happened to be the one who was doing it. And she was gone from school for like 3 days. And when she showed back up, she looked at me, she said, I know it was you. Why did you tell them? All you did was make it worse. I think she was 16 at the time. And it broke my heart for the next 2 years. And she looked at me, she said, I can deal with it for 2 more years, and then I'm gone, and I'll never go home. The school system failed her because they did not follow the procedures they were required to follow. Now, granted, this was back in the 90s, and we were not good at this back then. Hopefully we've come a lot farther. But oftentimes, we have not. And it's always best to err on the side of protecting that child at all costs. So you would contact the pastor, and the pastor is responsible then to deal with that and push that up. Because we're, like I said, we are mandatory reporting agents. Anything else? Okay, well, let's just take a walkabout, and we'll do that. You guys are doing a great job, aren't they?
Jared's sitting there on his phone.
Sharing this phone, not paying attention, or supervising the young people.
In his defense, he's not watching. He's not watching.
Lydia's
doors-
babysitting.
Lydia's, but there are adults present with Lydia who's babysitting.
There's only one kid in there that's not their child, so.
Yes, Julian.
We're gonna go downstairs.
Jared's
or-
most famous life.
So, I don't know.
Is that
I'd
more
have to
like
check
if
on
it's
that.
happening at the church?
Not necessarily.
Like-
Let's say somebody, it's dark down here. Can you see it down here? Is it okay?
Gotcha.
So as we're down here, as we just look down here, we've got a couple classrooms with nice metal core doors. Are these unlocked? Oh, they are. What are we missing? Okay. Do we ever have young people in here?
Yes.
Okay.
With the door open.
Now, that's another, I was just gonna ask that. Mark and Mary, you guys are often down here with our youth. When you're down here with the youth doing Sunday school, do you have the door open?
Always open.
Always open, okay. So
First
that's
of all,
the key
because
part.
it's hotter than,
Especially when it's hot, yes, yes.
very
So-
reasons,
So,
And there's all these
we were
windows.
aware of the policy, so.
yeah, I mean, you do have windows in here, that's a good point. But yes, they are fine, they do keep the door open. These were actually, there's like 3 rooms down here I was like curious about mostly, but yes. So yeah, the door's always open when you're down here. We do have the windows though, that is true. They do have curtains for a little bit, but you can see through them. So any questions other than the door, but the door is open. And that, again, you do what you have to do in your environment, so you follow that. Mark and Mary, they're always down here together, but they are the same family. But again, you do what you have to do in that. But you do have multiple people in here, so it's never just Mary with one teenager or anything like that. What are you pointing at?
The ceiling is
Moving?
visually.
Wow, what
Would
is
that
it?
would that be your other child?
no, that might be my child.
That might be your child. Okay.
Oh, they did get him. Rob just texted me.
Okay.
Okay. Are we all in here? Celeste, are you the last one right there? You and Mary? Okay. So obviously this was repurposed as our youth room. We use it for the Sunday school class with adults, but the youth use this quite a bit. So something to be aware of, because I know this has popped up a couple of times. So we're talking about safe sanctuaries with like us as leaders and working, but also to be aware of, it's also for the youth themselves, right? So are they ever in here unsupervised? Yes, they are. I myself have been culprit of that. Oh, Mom's okay if you unlock the door. I think that was Kim's daughter telling me, hey, can we go in there? It's okay. Mom said it's okay to unlock the door.
She also doesn't ask me things, she just.
I knew she had, but something else was said. But something to be aware of is creating a safe space, even for themselves, right? Like we look at this for adult leaders, but the reality is keeping it a safe space for them. I'm aware of young persons who've done things they shouldn't have done with even younger persons sometimes in churches. And so you always want to create those spaces. So the reality is this is not a room where they should just hang out without some adult supervision when they're in here. Yes, most of the time the door will be open. Like anybody did it, the door was open, there were adults right there and so forth. But we just want to be aware of that, okay? Any questions? Can you think of anything else, Gerald, that I should cover? The one thing that I did not mention, I've only encountered this really was direct issue. We do things in the community with between our produce, with our events, our parties, whatnot, and we posting pictures of young people online. I usually try to refrain from that unless the parent is with them in that picture, things like that. The only time I've ever had a really bad concern about that was we did have a young person in one of my churches years ago who was in a safe space with adoptive parents that was under protection. And I was told when I got there, in no way, shape, or form is that child or her adoptive parents ever allowed to be put online, shown in worship, anything like that. At this point, she was I think like a 15-year-old teenager, but it went bad for like 10 years. And I don't know the story behind it, I just was told never, ever, ever allow that person. So something to keep in mind, if we're going to use their image for any reason, be it on the website, Facebook page, we really should have permission and not just post pictures of them doing that. I've done that before in ministries. We help serve people, and somebody's coming through, and you're helping pictures. You're doing a group event thing. You're taking a picture, and somebody's like, you can't do that because something in their past as well. So you just want to be aware of that. That's something to always be aware. Don't just take pictures and put it out there and whatnot. Okay.
Yeah, and that can be a parent's preference too.
It's a parent's preference. Always. Yep. I agree. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's a parent's preference. Anything else? Questions? Comments? So we ran through it really, really quick, but if you ever do have a question, call me, okay? You can call the Gerald or Jennifer. We can touch base on these things if you ever have a question or something. I do want to check into what you asked me, though. I do want to check in on that. Because Rachel asked, in their training, they're taught to contact Children Protective Services directly. And not like go through the principal of the school or anything like that. So I'll need to check. I've always been trained, we contact the pastor, and then it's moved up into the conference, and then they deal with any legalities and whatnot. So I have to double check on that.
Yeah, in
I
my
will
school
make that-
building, the staff member that witnesses
Yeah.
it or
Yep,
is told is the
yep.
one who has to report it.
So I will double
So if
check.
we tell the nurse or tell the principal, they tell us, you're the one who was
Yeah.
confided in or saw it, you make the
Yes.
phone call. So that's the same.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. I will double check on that this week and get a word back on that to get to you, because I think that's a great question. Celeste, anything else? Anything I missed? Anything you guys think we should touch on? Okay, it's mostly just be aware of your environment, right? Be aware of your environment with our sofas. I joke about the sofas, but it is something just to be aware of. Just always keep a safe space for children, vulnerable persons, and be aware of. Like for example, if I'm meeting, let's say Celeste gives me a call and says she needs to talk with me. I always generally, if it's going to be behind closed doors, I will ask. Are you okay if I close the door? If it's private, can I close the door? Or would you prefer the door to be open? That's the preference I've always done to protect myself as well as that person. And I think that is a key part of that. It's just that communication and know your environment. Okay? All right. Be blessed.